Hello, everyone. My name is Andy Nowicki. I am the Nameless One, and this is the Nameless Podcast. Now, I said my name was Andy Nowicki. Then I said I am the Nameless One, and this is the Nameless Podcast. Ponder that paradox if you care to. Today, I want to talk about a couple of debates that are raging on our corner of the internet. And well, when I call them debates, they're not really debates. They're more like a hostile back and forth, which is really not what I would call a debate. A debate is an exchange of ideas. Unfortunately, a lot of what passes for debate is just more or less posturing and portraying oneself a certain way and trying to cast the opponent in an unfavorable light. And that is often what goes on under the guise of debate, is why I tend to avoid debate, because really, what's the point? There is no true exchange of ideas. And actually, to add to that, there can't really be an exchange of ideas. There can't really be a debate that gets anywhere unless there is some shared first principle. If we agree on something fundamental, then we can have a fruitful conversation about how to achieve that first principle. But if there's no agreement on first principle, then there's really no point in having a conversation. This is why, for example, I think debates about abortion tend to be a waste of time, because hey, if you believe in abortion, if you think that abortion should be permissible, then you must not think that all human life is worthy of defense. And if you're against abortion, it's probably because you think that defenseless human life is something that should not be taken, that should not be aggressed upon. And that is your first principle. But you've got the opponent who thinks different. Of course, he might phrase it differently than that. He might say, well, the fetus is not a life, and that, but that's skullduggery, rhetorical skullduggery. If it's not human, what is it? If it's not a life, what is it? So again, just taking the example of abortion is one thing, and of course I'm phrasing it in a way that's friendly to my position on the issue, but I'm not meaning to do it that way, or that's not my intention here. What I'm trying to demonstrate is that when you have no shared first principle, then what are you going to have in a quote-unquote debate? It's probably a lot of hot air. You're going to have a lot of back and forth where one side characterizes the other side as ghastly, and then the other side responds by saying, oh yeah, well, we're not ghastly, you're the ones who are ghastly, and then more or less posturing along those lines. Now, as an anti-abortion person, I do think that denying the truth that an unborn child is human life is really an untenable stance, and it cannot be held without a good deal of intellectual disingenuousness, or simply naivete, not having thought it through, because I don't think you can say that it's anything else. There's an obvious continuity from conception forward, from conception until the death of the organism. So again, coming from my position, I would say that the other side is immediately taking a stance that is either something that they should know better than, or something they haven't thought about enough. But again, somebody who's pro-choice or pro-abortion would no doubt phrase it differently. The point is that we would have to ultimately think that, again, I would say from my point of view, that the other side just needs to be woken up, needs to be shown the light, or needs to understand, or just simply be honest in a way that they're not being honest, and the other side would take a different type of stand on the issue. But there's no point in really having a debate, because there is no shared first principle in the example that I've given. Now, when you have no shared first principle, and things generally tend to devolve from there into some kind of rhetorical catfight, and things tend to get ugly just because, you have two people taking two different sides, each of whom wants to demonstrate his own goodness, his own nobility, and the other side's stupidity and evil, or regressiveness, or however you want to put it. It becomes a very us versus them kind of thing. And in that case, there really is no debate per se. Now, to the subject at hand, there have lately been a lot of articles written about the alt-right movement, and these articles have been written at various semi-mainstream and mainstream sources, and this is something I've remarked upon in a previous podcast as well. I've talked about the temptation to get really excited and say, oh boy, they're talking about us, even if, as is often the case, these are very negative, scathing, in many cases unearnedly scathing. I think there's a lot of criticism that can be leveled at the alt-right movement personally, as someone who's putatively a part of it, but a lot of these articles are just rather obnoxious hit pieces that speak very broadly about things, and don't really even come close to examining the actual problems, the actual issues that are there, but are more like, oh, look at these people. They're so terrible. Make fun of them. They're so stupid, and they think that they're intellectual, and they put these sneer quotes around the term intellectual, and they're referring to the people like Evola and others who have influenced the contemporary alt-right scene, when in fact someone like Evola probably knows about 10 times more than whoever this hack writer is, and yet he's sneering at him by saying the quote-unquote intellectual, because he doesn't share the same generally unthought presuppositions that this hack writer has. These propositions that he's taken on more or less just because they're reflexive to him. So he very unearnedly sneers at these other people by calling them quote unquote intellectual. I mean, this is the level of discourse that we find in a lot of these articles. Not all of them. Some of them, they don't all sink that low all of the time. And as I was saying, there's plenty about the alt-right movement that I think can legitimately be discussed and critiqued. And I would be very interested in seeing an article that is written from somebody who's outside of the alt-right movement but is interested in being fair to the alt-right movement, but at the same time isn't concerned with flattering and doesn't pull any punches in its assessment of the alt-right. I haven't really seen an article. Well, I guess I've actually maybe seen a couple of articles that would somewhat fit that description, but not too damn many. In any case, it is exciting, and it's understandable that you would get excited, although I think it's a misguided response. We can't really help the way that we respond to things, part of our programming, as I've talked about before and written about before. We want to be acclaimed. We want to be taken seriously. We want to think that we are on the path to power, or whatever the case may be. My stance has always been that it's not about achieving power. And, I'm not interested in ascending to some level of power or fame or what have you that would give me a chance to rule the roost, rule the realm. I don't think that's what it should be about. I think the aim should be to persevere and to refuse to back down, to be defiant regardless of what the situation is, to be true to your principles regardless of whether you are in favor or in disfavor, regardless of whether you are being given a fair shot or not being given a fair shot. That is the true test, is being true to what you see the truth as being, to be true to your vision of truth. But to return to the subject at hand, one of the more of many egregious hit pieces that have been written recently about the alt-right movement is one that was written for The Federalist by the writer Jamie Kirchick, and starts with this rather unpromising title, Why White Nationalist Thugs Thrill to Trump. You know right away, right off the bat, that you're being called thugs, your position is being called a thuggish position, then even though I'm not a Trump supporter, and not everybody in the alt-right is a Trump supporter. And of course, I'm only putatively in the alt-right in the first place. So, although I'm the assistant editor of the online publication known as Alternative Right, I don't know if I'm definitely an outlier in the alt-right movement, generally speaking, in many ways, but I don't want to get too introspective. Returning to the article, which doesn't make any effort at all to be fair, he talks about how people on the alt-right are contra Milo Yiannopoulos' words, the piece that Milo wrote for Breitbart, which is generally speaking fairly positive in its assessment about the alternative right, even though some people say that it's not accurate. Kirchick says, no, they're actually just thugs and idiots, and he, according to this article on VDare, which is responding to Kirchick's article, Kirchick was on a show, a podcast, where he was asked if the alt-right had sex appeal, and he responded, I'm not sure how successful these guys are with women. And then he goes on to say a few other things, that, there's a very unsubtle homoerotic to this whole thing. Yeah, in other words, the alt-right are just a bunch of faggots. And of course, there's the famous or infamous words of Mr. Joe Wilson, which I've talked about before, saying that the alt-right is a bunch of single men who jerk off to anime porn. Now, these kinds of assessments, these kinds of pot shots, I think are very unimaginative. There can be something fun to this pure ad hominem, low blow kind of exchange if you have a certain standard to aim for. If you're aiming for really being creative or original, these quips or these put downs or what have you, then it can be like a good, East Coast, West Coast, beef or Ice-T versus NWA in the late 80s. But there's something about this whole put down of ha ha ha, you're just a loser, that I want to address right now on a couple of different levels. First of all, I've mentioned this before, I think, although maybe not in a podcast, maybe not in any of my articles at Alternative Right or elsewhere, but I do remember it occurring to me, and I remember mentioning this point, making this point to others, that this whole line of insult of you live in your parents' basement and you're a loser is well, it was funny one time back in, I think it was maybe 85 or 86 or so. And I remember this is, I think, where this meme, although they didn't call it even back then, that word wasn't really in the lexicon. But it happened when William Shatner was hosting Saturday Night Live, and there was a sketch where he is talking to all these Star Trek nerds, and he just goes off on them and says, you people are pathetic. What you need to do is you need to move out of your parents' basement, for God's sake. And at the time, it was hilarious. It was the first time that we had heard that phrase used, or the first time I had. I think the first time a lot of people had. And, it pointed to some underlying truth maybe about some Trekkies, some of the more pitiful types of people who just get caught up in a cult of this kind, a pop culture cult, and not, who don't do anything with their lives but go on worshiping this TV show. So it pointed to some truth, and the best comedy does that. And so it was funny. It was very fresh at that time, but that was back in 1986. Okay, how many years later? 30 years later? I mean, goodness gracious! Can we just find a new insult? The Wilson insult about anime porn is just another variation of the you live in your parents' basement kind of insult. But they're both a part of the same line of attack, the ad hominem line of attack. And again, ad hominem can be interesting at times. It's never it's never fair, of course, because ad hominem is a logical fallacy. It's not arguing the issue. It's just saying the other person is bad or the other person is pathetic and doesn't deserve a response. So in that sense, ad hominem is always beside the point, never addresses the issue, never addresses what the issue is. But also, let's go beyond the point about ad hominem, being a logical fallacy, and let's just consider this particular line of insult, this particular way of making fun of the opponent by calling him a loser. Well, I mean, I already addressed the point that it's kind of lame. It's not really that funny. It's a joke that's at least 30 years old with very little variation besides the anime porn stuff, which I guess a slight upgrade or slightly bringing it into the present, since there wasn't anime online porn in 1986 when Shatner delivered this speech on Saturday Night Live, because there was no online in 1986. But leaving all of that aside, let's just stick with the question of your opponent is a loser. You demonstrate that your opponent is some lazy, no good person who hasn't accomplished anything in his life, who's unsuccessful, who's unattractive, who can't get laid. It seems to be a frequent thing. Oh, well, we can get laid. You guys, you can't lay. And that's sort of what Kerchik was alleging with his little tirade. But on the other hand, this VDare article more or less turned this whole insult thing around and said, well, Kerchik actually is, he talks about the alt-right probably being gay and indulges in this gay baiting, but he actually is a homosexual, and he's a pretty nerdy-looking homosexual at that, and here he is wearing these dumb rainbow suspenders while being interviewed on RT.com. All right, now, this is kind of the same thing. It's the whole loser trope, saying, no, we aren't the real losers, you guys are the real losers. And again, this article at VDare was more or less making that point. It was saying that people in the alternative right, the reason why they stay anonymous is because they actually have successful lives and successful careers, and they don't want that to get ruined. They've got a lot to lose. And so they make that point about the alternative right saying, nah, we're not losers. They sort of throw in this to take this shot at Kerchik, which I'm not standing up for him because he's like a jerk, but it is more or less doing the same thing that he was doing, saying, he's the real loser and blah, blah, blah. And well, let's just stay with the point of the so-called loser thing, all right? If somebody is a loser, if somebody's unsuccessful, if somebody's unattractive, if somebody lives in their parents' basement, does that make them wrong? Does that mean that you are correct on the issue and they are incorrect on the issue? No, it doesn't. There have been plenty of extremely successful people throughout history who have had very productive lives. They've gotten a lot of attention from the opposite sex. They've had great careers and so forth. And they've been total duds, intellectually speaking. They've just sort of parroted what everybody else is saying, or they haven't really uncovered that much new information. This isn't to put aside any of their genuine successes or render them moot, but it is to say that being a successful person, being a well-coiffed person, having good hair and a nice suit and a nice style of presentation, and I don't know, having made a lot of money and having a lot of friends, this doesn't mean that you are correct on the issue. And on the other hand, being this pathetic, unsuccessful layabout who goes from one low-grade job to another and, can't get a date, doesn't have many friends, okay? This kind of person who doesn't do well in life. Well, he could have plenty of good ideas. In fact, there is no relationship between him being quote unquote unsuccessful, him being quote unquote a loser in life, and his ideas. Just as with the so-called winner in life, there is no correlation between being a winner in life and having good ideas either. In other words, you can be a winner and have crappy ideas, and you can be a loser and have really good ideas. You can be a loser and see the truth in a way that the winner cannot or does not. I'm not saying that being a winner in life means that you are unable to see the truth, or that being a loser makes you more better positioned to discern the truth. But I am saying that there is no relationship. There's no necessary relationship between one and the other. And so as a rhetorical cheap shot in this case, it really falls quite flat. It really is rather pathetic. It's nothing more than a schoolyard taunt. And unfortunately, I've heard this same line of insult used in another case, one in which I am more inclined to agree with this one particular side, except the fact that he is characterizing the people who disagree with him as neckbeards, as fedora-wearing, fat, pathetic losers. Again, in this case, I am on very much, I'm not going to reveal the name of this particular case, but it is rather incredibly egregious. And again, I am on the side of the person who is slinging this ad hominem in this and assailing the online atheist community, who, again, he says wear fedoras and have neckbeards and are fat and can't get laid. But again, this is just sophomoric, uncreative taunting, and it doesn't get at anywhere near the truth, and it doesn't advance any kind of debate. And it's interesting, I guess you could say that I'm sensitive on this subject, because, as you may have guessed, I am a loser. And by that I mean I'm not someone who has achieved very much in his lifetime. I'm not successful. I am not well known. I am not popular. But and I'm not sensitive about that, in the sense that if you want to say that I'm a loser, if you want to say that I'm unsuccessful, well, you're telling the truth. All right. And gosh, it's kind of harsh for you to say it. But if you want to say it and you want to point out the many ways in which that is true, then, I can't really argue with that. But if you're going to say we don't have to pay attention to Nowicki, we don't have to really take his ideas seriously at all, because what's he ever accomplished? I mean, look at these people over here. They've accomplished so many things. They disagree with Nowicki. Here's Nowicki over here. He has his little opinions. Yeah, but look at him. I mean, he's unsightly and he's poor and wretched, and I mean, come on. This kind of ad hominem, I take it personally, not because I want to say I am not a loser, quote unquote, as you define it, as I'm defining it here, but simply because I think it's wrong to dismiss a person's perspective based on aspects of him which really don't relate to his perspective. And again, I think a lot of this stems from really politics. It's about positioning, as I was saying earlier on in the podcast. It's about trying to establish your side as having this certain kind of image, and trying to establish the other side as, being disreputable or unserious, or somebody you don't really have to take serious. And so, again, it's not much of a debate. There's not much about ideas being expressed. And again, I wouldn't mind that so much if the ad hominem wasn't so damn sophomoric, and this whole guy who lived in his parents' basement thing. Again, I want to make it clear, I don't live in my parents' basement, but metaphorically speaking, I do. So you want to attack people who are down and out, who don't live in their parents' basement, or who do live in their parents' basement, and contrast them with these good-looking, well-coiffed, successful people over here. That is a highly ignoble way of framing the debate, such as it is. And I do wish that there would be less loser shaming out there. It's telling that among the kinds of things that are assailed, the kinds of shaming that are assailed out there, like slut shaming, of course, there's nothing today in today's cultural environment. It's fine to be a slut. In fact, it's good to be a slut. So complaints about slut shaming don't really amount to much because sluts already aren't judged or aren't looked down upon. But losers, I want to say, and I'm saying this without self-pity, just making an observation. Losers are, particularly male losers, are looked down upon by the culture at large, whether it's the right, the left, whomever. And it seems to me that in many ways the alternative right in a lot of ways is just a reflection of the mainstream with certain things altered or changed. And this is something I have discerned a lot lately, hearing some of the rhetoric that comes out of the alt-right, which I'm not going to get into as much right now because I'm about at the end of our time. But I just wanted to make the point that next time you want to establish the truth of your position and the untruth of your opponent's position, try to avoid this kind of egregious, bottom of the barrel scraping, loser shaming. You know, I'm not even saying that you shouldn't call a loser and a winner, but have some awareness and know that calling your opponent a loser isn't addressing the matter that you are debating him on. And in fact, you might be a winner, he might be a loser, but he might be right and you might be wrong. Just keep that in mind. Thank you all for listening. Talk to y'all again soon.